So for my talk, we moved to the late 3rd century or early 4th century Diospolis in Upper Egypt, also known as Thebes. By this time, most, if not all, once flourishing temples, such as Karnak, were no longer in operation. And this was not something confined to Thebes. All over Egypt, temples had closed. A few were still intact, most notably the Isis temple at Philae or the Bukis temple in Hermontis, a bit south of Thebes. Scattered references from contemporary papyrus indicate a few other temples were also still in operation, at least partly. And in this time also Christianity had become a force, but pagan cults were still around. And I should point out that most of the temples closed by the early 3rd century. So Thebes was a very different place in the 3rd or 4th century than it had been in the 2nd century. The 2 manuscripts in the center of my talk were produced in this environment. That is, a time when the traditional centers of learning or knowledge production had moved out of the temples into other arenas. And the 2 texts that are at the core of my talk relate to this question. But before I explain this relation, I need to say a few words about these 2 codices. The 2 papyrus manuscripts, known as the Leiden and the Stockholm codex, are 2 recipe collections from the late 3rd or the early 4th centuries. The recipes deal with procedures concerning gilding, production of metallic inks, dyeing, producing precious stones, and so on. And the 2 texts were written by the same individual and can be seen as complementary of each other, with a different emphasis on different procedures in the 2 manuscripts. That is, one work perhaps divided up into 2 codices. Aside from containing recipes, the Leiden part also contains extracts from the 1st century medical writer Dioscorides, and more specifically relating to botanical products used in the various procedures mentioned in the 2 codices. Some of the procedures described make clear that the product would only appear as something. Others, however, seem to suggest that a person producing these materials believed that he was really producing something more valuable than the sum of the ingredients taken together, and you can see the examples here. Now, partly because of the recipes seen on the screen, the 2 manuscripts have been occasionally understood as belonging to a craftsman producing objects for a varied audience, or belonging to a charlatan, a person who was well aware that his products were not the real stuff. A few of the recipes suggest that a user of the text would have been involved in something more than merely producing materials. They suggest that he may have been involved in producing figurines and images as well, which could hint at some sort of smith. Yes. While the 2 manuscripts usually feature in discussions about the origin of alchemy, the rather prosaic nature of many of the instructions had led many scholars to suggest that the 2 texts were not alchemical per se. The motivation for this judgment has been that such recipes, to be considered alchemical, a technical description of a procedure would not be enough, but recipes must be anchored in an epistemological tradition that explains the procedures. These explanations do not necessarily need to follow modern chemical standards, but can rather be rooted in what seems to be supernatural powers. That is, some form of divine agency guided the transmutation process. So, are we dealing with something related to, but not entirely equivalent to alchemy here? Well, obviously it depends on how one defines the subject. But let us look at the texts. Are there mere recipes that do not relate to any theoretical framework? I would claim they are not entirely void of a context. A few of them are attributed to well-known characters, which means that they were produced in a particular intellectual framework. Names such as Democritus, Africanus, and Anaxagoras appear in the recipes, and a 4th name is Phimenas of Sais. It is unclear who this character was, but one can speculate whether this name is not a version of Parmenas. Now, this is a name that appears in some ancient sources, and this person is described as an astrologer, another as an alchemist, and an Egyptian priest that knew about double-headed snakes and winged scorpions. The name is clearly Egyptian and seems to be alluding to a pharaonic founder, the pharaonic founder king Menes, who was a figure well known at the time the two codices were composed. While these references can be seen as scattered, they still show that the texts were copied from a collection that one must understand was slotted in, at least to some extent, with what is commonly called alchemy. Additionally, some of the recipes pertain to magical procedures, meaning that the same type of thinking made up the foundations of these procedures. One obvious case is the use of urine from an uncorrupted boy. No doubt urine would have had some useful chemical properties, but to define it as coming from an uncorrupted child gives the recipe the same, or makes us understand that the recipe's functions are according to the same analogical thinking that formed the basis for much of the contemporary magical practices. The purity of the origin of the substance used was then perhaps viewed as transferred onto the product of the procedure. Another example could be the idea that a tree which produces a fruit which is associated with green, at least before it's ripened, namely the olive, should be burned in the production of emerald, a green stone, thus green to produce green, a sort of sympathetic thinking. And there are other types of ingredients in the corpus indicating a similar rationale. While the two manuscripts can be viewed as complementary of each other, they are also related to another set of texts. Namely, the texts were found together with the so-called Theban Magical Library. This is a name given to a collection of Greco-Egyptian grimoires that date to the period between the 2nd century and the 4th century. These texts were not written by one person, but it's probable that the same individual or group of individuals deposited all these texts wherever they were found, somewhere in Thebes. The oldest layers of these magical texts are written in a mix of Greek and Egyptian, Demotic and Old Coptic, and mostly concern magical procedures. There are also some recipes intermingled among the magical procedures that remind of the practices described in the two codices, for instance, producing inks. Whoever deposited texts together would at least have access to the Greek part of these texts, and that was enough for him or them to consider them as important. The producers of the oldest manuscripts must have been Egyptian temple priests. At the time the texts were written, Demotic, the written language, had largely been confined to this environment, and it was no longer used in society at large. However, Egyptian as a spoken language still existed. What is quite striking is that the person who produced the two codices also wrote two of these magical texts. The first one is a very short spell known as PGM V, which is an invocation to the sun god Helios, to have a direct vision of the god. The purpose would be to put oneself into direct communication with the god to gain his assistance in any matter. The text was not only written by the same practitioner, but in fact seemingly was inserted as a loose leaf into the Stockholm Codex. Was this an accident? I would argue it was not. The other manuscript that he wrote, or half of it at least, is PGM XIII. The text is far longer and more complicated and consists of a triplicate of a text which has the purpose to get the practitioner initiated and have direct contact with a god. And this god will then complete any wish that the magician may have. And that part seems similar between these texts. But there are two other relevant factors in this text which I want to highlight, among many. First is that it contains several excursus, and one of them mentions Erotylos, which may refer to the same individual as the 3rd or 4th century alchemist Zosimos of Panopolis also refers to in his writings. And this, of course, could indicate that some sort of familiarity with the world which has traditionally been associated with alchemy. But what is perhaps more relevant is the fact that the magical text also refers to a work called the Ptolemaica, specifically a fifth book of this collection, which people have understood as a pseudo-epigraphic work attributed to the 2nd century scholar Claudius Ptolemy. And this section concerns the unified nature of fire and darkness. And the work is, the fifth book is so-called Hen Kai Tupan, and all is one. The phrase is often regarded as expressing one of the basic tenets of alchemy, that all materials are in fact one and the same matter. There are also other relevant aspects in this text. One is that it explicitly states that the purpose of the ritual is to make the divinity appear, and this divinity is to explain and even change the ritualist's horoscope. But the method used to make the divinity appear requires profound astrological and astronomical knowledge. And various positions of planets are explained as particularly efficient for conjuring the god, who then is to explain a horoscope. It is rather obvious that the practitioner would have been able to cast his own horoscope with the knowledge needed for summoning the god. One could thus argue that the purpose was not so much to have the god do something that the practitioner could not, although partly he did, but also the fact that the god did it rather than the practitioner. And one wonders whether this not the same could have been applicable to these alchemical codices. And I would be inclined to see the presence of PGM V as suggesting this. And it's even feasible to think that our practitioner would have been one of those which Zosimus, the famous alchemist I mentioned, who he mentions in his polemics, that we have alchemists that rely on proper timing and demons for their art. And according to the Panapolitan, that made them subject to fate, which was something a proper alchemist would avoid. And he refers to these people as priests. Now, given the fact that the temples had closed at this time, could they be? Or is this in fact just a rhetorical device known from late Roman Egypt? In theological debates, one could accuse one's opponent of being a pagan priest. And I say that without going into the question on whether Zosimus was in fact a Christian or not. So instead of trying to connect the two manuscripts to the sacred craftsmen of the Egyptian temple, although we know many of the techniques and approaches would surely have been the same, used by the priests and the people who may have used these texts, I will instead speculate about who the group of people that potentially may have used these manuscripts were. Now, while the temples at Thebes had largely fallen out of function in this region, right, not all pagan religious practices had disappeared. The Theban West Bank was not only the probable find spot of these manuscripts, but there was also the place, or this is also the site of the largely defunct temple at Deir el Bahri. What? All right, okay, I will finish then very quickly. While this temple is mostly associated with the mortuary cult of Hatshepsut from roughly 1500 years earlier, it also housed a Ptolemaic-era chapel to two gods of healing and science, Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu. While this chapel at this time was largely non-operational, as the manuscripts were written, the area was still home to some religious rituals. A group of ironworkers from Hermontis visited the site with some regularity during the late 3rd and early 4th century AD, the same time as these texts may have been written. And they performed sacrificial rites, sacrificing donkeys, and they drank beer. Communal beer drinking is something that was central to Egyptian religious associations of the traditional religion. Now, one assumes that they were still active, these ironworkers, in some cultic activities in their hometown as well, because we know the temples were still open there. And they were also professional craftsmen. While time is too short for any detailed discussion now, craftsmen with some type of sacred knowledge seems to me not to be a mere fantasy based on these two manuscripts, but in fact something that really existed around Egypt at the time. So perhaps we can imagine something similar about the context of our manuscripts and the people behind them. They could have belonged to a group of craftspeople, an association of craftspeople, who at the same time were engaged in something that was not only the productions of materials and figurines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Was this set of ideas or beliefs a religion of its own, or did it have any connection with traditional ancient Egyptian religion?
As I think you can see a connection to traditional practices, at least. Obviously, Egyptian gods could create. You have a creator god who creates different materials, and we have, in fact, demotic texts, recipes for dyeing, for instance, which are attributed to one of these creator gods. So in that sense, you can see it. In these manuscripts, there's nothing explicit, save for in the magical texts, where there is some relevant references to traditional Egyptian.
Because as I read it in the book, this idea of transformation resembles the resurrection of Osiris, for instance.
Yes.
So the gods, the old gods, are present still.
In some form, yes. I claim that, yes.
In some form, but what is new then with alchemy, which makes it different from earlier beliefs?
I would say that the new thing is that this is a time of more religious syncretism, but in fact, at the core of the idea, you can sort of trace that back to Egyptian practices, because we have these recipes and they are attributed to a god, and that's why they work. Obviously, chemically they would also work, but the motivation behind them is that it comes from a god. So I say that is something, a red thread, which we see. And I would say there is basically the same principle here in these manuscripts.
Is it true that without alchemy we would not have well-preserved mummies today?
If you want to call mummification alchemy, yes. It's a sort of transmutation of the human body into a divine body.
Yes, but also the practical preserving the body with alloys, dyes, colors.
Actually, it's usually dryness
Okay.
that does it. And the Egyptians themselves, what they did occasionally helps to preserve a body, but in fact, quite often rather destroys it. And the better preserved bodies are those which just dry out properly.
Okay. Andreas, thank you for this excellent start.
Thank you.